Welcome to the Ketogeek podcast. We live in the information age, and we are here to help you sift through processed information and find innovative solutions that work. Let's do this. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ketogeek podcast. My name is Fahad, and I am once again joined by
your friendly neighborhood alchemist, Corey Behn.
Corey, we've had a great weekend, haven't we?
We sure did, Fahad. It was freaking awesome.
We were here in Napa doing an event, which we will tell you guys in just a moment. Besides that, we've been really busy. We got some great testimonials for our products. We've been super duper uber busy. What's interesting to note over here is that this podcast is the second part to our series in which we show you guys how you can use processed foods to better your life and navigate the waters. I will add, though, that this podcast, of course, is how we live our life and how we think of food. It is not something that you should take as a gospel. If you have your own skepticisms, criticisms, they're all welcome, as always, with our podcast and with how we do things. And I'm very excited to have everybody on here because it literally, Corey, took us 3 to 4 years to get to this point, sifting through different types of diets, talking to vegans, vegetarians, carnivores of the apocalypse, and basically fruitarians too. We've been all over the place. And I am very, very, very excited. Are you?
Oh, yeah. This is an awesome thing, man.
I agree, but first of all, we need to tell everybody what Ketogeek is. So, Corey, I, being the most ignorant person on the planet, don't know what Ketogeek is. Could you explain to me what Ketogeek is?
Oh, sure. I'll explain it to the founder of Ketogeek. Ketogeek is a wonderful company. We make the Energypods. We also have a podcast. You're listening to it right now. We lead the world in information on health and nutrition, and we're trying to bridge food science and food nutrition together. This is Ketogeek. Now, what are those Energypods, Fahad?
Energypods, it all started in a galaxy far, far, actually, it started on Earth. When we just started working on these tiny little, we actually wanted to make a bar. Like many, many years ago. That was the original intention. We took that concoction that we made to a yoga studio in which you were my teacher, interestingly enough. Yep. I don't know if we mentioned that on the podcast, but now everybody knows. And over there, everybody just fell in love with that concoction, despite the fact that that concoction was not a bar, but it was in a sort of semi-solid liquid form. And then we decided, hey, let's just take this product and give it to other people. At that time, we thought that the ketogenic diet was going to help a lot of people become healthier and happier. And from that point on, we started to not just evolve the product, but we also evolved our podcast and our information. We surrounded ourselves with great minds, and boom, that little concoction is now called the Energypods. It comes in a compact 2-ounce cup. We call it a compact meal replacement. It's completely shelf-stable, and it is hands down one of the most, if not the most tastiest food product in the world. And we can really testify to that. If you guys just go to our Instagram or YouTube or any of these places and just look at those reviews, everybody loves them. It's like 100% love rate. Love at first sight rate. Love at first sight rate with the Energypods. They are nutrient dense, energy dense, completely crush resistant packaging. Well, I guess if you're going to land an airplane on it, they'll get destroyed. But in most functional uses, they're really strong and really powerful. How are they made, Corey?
Oh, they are made right here in Napa, California. They're made by hand. Now, what is really important about the Energypods and what is good to understand here is that the Energypods use a combination of high-quality ingredients, and we try to source these ingredients locally as much as possible. And then if we can't get them super local, like in California or in Napa, we look domestically and try to source products from the U.S. Now, these Energypods, they're called energy, but they don't have any stimulants whatsoever. You're getting energy from high-quality fats, such as MCT oil from a plant source, coconuts, and your ghee from butter, an animal source. There's also nuts in there. There's adequate proteins from whey protein isolate, at least 10 grams per pod. And there's also, despite the fact that they're the tastiest product on the planet, there's literally no added sugar, save for our chocolate Nova Energy Pod. It does have some really delicious, tiny, minuscule chocolate chips that explode with flavor as you crunch down on them. We also have a paperboard spoon included, and we even source that sucker right from our neighborhood city, Corte Madera. And they are ridiculously smooth. They're rich. I've heard it be described as 400 times better than Nutella. I like that. I like to hear that.
That was on the last event, right? Somebody said that?
Oh, yeah. He said this is like Nutella, but on steroids, pretty much. And it's healthy for you.
Exactly. And once you try these, you're gonna probably get ruined. Like, we skip the chocolate aisle, period. We don't even go there anymore. I mean, we go there just to find anything but chocolate, actually.
Yeah.
That's what we end up doing. So, yeah, if you try the energy pods, especially the chocolate Nova and the chocolate fudge, we are gonna ruin chocolate for you forever. And then, if you try our breakfast mocha noir, we ruin coffee for you forever.
That's right.
Because in that, we literally put straight up coffee beans. Normally, when you get a cup of coffee, it is water extracted. You get a part of the flavor, but with the energy pods, you get the entire flavor profile, everything. So that's why people know that this is not just a health product, but foodies and chefs and basically anybody in the food industry loves them. Even the food scientists that we've sent our product to love it. Fitness people love it too. Alan gave us a nice little review. Alan Aragon, I think. He gave us some nice shout outs and reviews there. So everybody loves the energy pods. It's just how good they are. Now, you can use them in many different ways. It originally started off as a keto low carb product, but we have from that point evolved it beyond that. You can pair it with wines. Once upon a time, actually a couple of times, we took it to a party and it became the centerpiece of the party for a while, and everybody loved it because we just left a little bit of energy pod on these new stems that we made and put them all around the table or in different places. People would just take their glass of wine, dip into the energy pod, and just eat the pod, a little bit of it, and then sort of cut through the whole flavor profile in their mouth using alcohol, which was fascinating. It's a wonderful experience. Try it out. It's just a unique thing. And it's coming from people here in Napa. For functional and outdoor uses, well, what's cool, man, is the new Chocolate Nova Energy Pod, which comes with a disc that attaches to magnetic surfaces. So we're really innovating this product. You can create some recipes out of it and have some fun. Corey, is there any interesting recipe that comes to your mind when it comes to any of our energy pods?
Yeah, speaking of recipes, we do these things called Energypod creations at live events that we're at. So if you are living in Napa and you're listening to this podcast, watch out for where we are going to be. We will have Energypod creations, and basically we take our pods, we open it up, and sell one to you with some delicious toppings on top. For example, I think the one that killed the entire crowd was Napa Praline. That was our pecan coconut with candied ginger and candied coconuts. And we have some stuff in the works for this flavor. We're not going to give it all away right now, but energy pods are so versatile. Like you said, you can take them to parties, to any function, to outdoors. You can even use them in your own home, make a recipe out of them, and have fun.
Yeah, and it's I'm glad you mentioned the phrase, our creations, that energy pod creations, which is really cool because it empowers the locals further. It creates a talking point, a certain social experience for tourists and people that come to Napa, and anywhere we do something like that. We want to empower locals, and that's very important because it is these small businesses, it is these local infrastructures that make a certain city or place unique. That's why people come to Napa. That's why people go to any of these cities which have a unique experience to them. So,
exactly.
So that's how you can use the energy pods. I think, Corey, how do you get them?
Yeah, speaking of getting supporting the locals and empowering the locals, you can find us in Napa Valley. We're up and down the Napa Valley, so Calistoga is at the very top if we're talking north-south orientation. We have Calistoga Cal Mart. We have Sunshine Foods Market, St. Helena. There is in Napa Board Garden on Jefferson Street and Jeffries General on 2nd Street, downtown Napa. There are more stores we'll be getting into very soon, so please look out for that on our socials or in our newsletter. We're even available in a really cool place called Red Lodge, Montana, at a company called Coffee Factory Roasters. And that town is the gateway to Yellowstone, Montana. So if you're going out to go see the wolves, to see the bears, to see some really cool geysers and pools of water that are more rainbowy than rainbows, stop by Red Lodge, grab some energy pods. You're gonna need the energy so you can enjoy Yellowstone.
Yep, and if you're a retailer, you can go to either Fair or Tundra. You guys probably know the lingo already if you're one of those vendors. And you can go grab some energy pods, and we will give you a display alongside it. You can purchase a display as well. These displays are really awesome. They come with a magnetic surface, which works really well with our Infinity Series energy pod, which just magnetically attaches to the surface itself. These displays also contain an NFC chip, which is really interesting. In case you have some frontline workers who don't know what the energy pod is, they can just take their phone and scan the NFC chip on the display, and then they can find out more about the product itself. This is great for customers too, because that allows those customers to learn about the product, and we have some snippets about nutrition information as well. So if somebody wants to learn about, hey, what are carbohydrates, fats, proteins, calories, micros, they can learn that from that NFC chip as well. So this is not just a great product, but we're also having the side effect of educating the masses and the retail front workers. This is a win-win for everybody that we're trying to do over here, especially with this new podcast that we're going to do today. This episode is really awesome.
Oh, yeah.
So as far as news is concerned, Corey, I think we should mention over here that we are always at Feast It Forward on the second Sunday. I think that I assume that event's going to consistently go on for the rest of the year, right?
I believe it is going to continue through summer at the very least. We'll have to double check, but at the very least, we know it is second Sundays throughout the summer months, and we are looking for more events that are local to us. So if you guys have any ideas, shoot an email to us. We'd love to hear it. Yep,
and Feast It Forward, as we were touching bases, it's a beautiful place. I just call it the Disneyland of adults in Napa. That's just how it is.
Good way to describe it.
It's very kid-friendly, too. We see these little guys and gals all over the place. It's awesome. And there's a great amount of culinary experience. Great for tourists, great for locals. Everybody's invited. And I think that's about it, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much it here as far as news is concerned.
All right. With that being said, guys and gals, we started to talk about what this podcast was all about, but just to give you guys a little bit of a refresher, we call this the Energypod framework. Why do we call it the framework? Because it is basically just a side effect of what we do already, and we're just sharing this information with you. Let's just do this. Welcome back to the podcast again. We're going to get into the body of the show. However, before we get into the body of the show, we need to talk about some of the stuff we sort of like a refresher and talk about stuff we previously talked about so everybody's on the same page. First of all, I apologize. It was actually episode 76 that we started off this journey with, not 74. So, Corey, if I were to ask you a very simple question, it would be, what is food? So tell me, what is food?
Yes, food is a matrix of constituents. So you have a matrix of, it could, like bread, for example. That's a matrix of proteins, carbohydrates, and probably a little bit of fats. It's basically how the food is structured. And that is the basic, very, very simple explanation for what food is.
Exactly. It is something that sustains you, provides you with nourishment, provides you with a wonderful experience. It is made up of macronutrients, micronutrients, flavor components, additives, and even anti-nutrient properties. Because some plants don't want to be eaten. So they got some stuff going on over there that sort of slows it down or sort of inhibits the absorption of certain micronutrients or certain components of the food. But what are macronutrients? So macronutrients, there's proteins, fats, carbohydrates. Proteins are your building blocks. Fats and carbohydrates are your source of energy. Together, they create the energy, sort of like they contribute towards the energy need of the body, and that's why you might have heard the term called calories. Calories in, calories out. If you go under the calories requirements, then you're going to lose weight. If you're going to go above it, you're going to gain weight. So that forms the premise of our Energypod framework. It's very much sort of like an evolution of the energy balance model, sort of complements it based on our understanding of food. And beyond macronutrients, we have micronutrients, which consist of vitamins and minerals. These are tiny little bit of chemicals and isolates and stuff that you require for your body. Usually you get them alongside your macros as well in many raw and edible and different kinds of foods. Now, there's something that a lot of people don't talk about, which is the flavor components of food. So flavor consists of taste, smell, color, temperature, and texture. You might be wondering, why temperature? Well, look at ice cream, for example. Ice cream is a semi-solid or a solid at frozen temperatures, but as soon as you put it into your mouth, it melts away and turns into a liquid. Something similar happens with bread. It is a solid, but as soon as you start chewing it down, it turns into a semi-solid sort of concoction and rapidly disintegrates into sort of a liquid form down in your GI tract. It's really fascinating how that works. So next up, we have additives that are added to food. A lot of the times, these are simply components that already exist in other foods, and they're just put into this new food or a different food so that it can enhance its shelf life or maybe have a certain stimulant effect. Corey, what's the most famous stimulant on planet Earth?
No, everybody loves it. It's called caffeine.
Caffeine. It's also a drug, but it's a legal drug, and everybody consumes it. It is how America works. We don't have any more veins and arteries with blood cells in them. We have caffeine in our blood at this point of humanity and United States specifically. Now, we do have anti-nutrients, which can sort of inhibit or sort of slow down the absorption of nutrients or just completely not make them absorb at all, such as phytic acid. And so this basically covers up all of what makes up food based on our understanding. For more, like I said, you can go to episode 76. Now, let's give everybody a little bit of an explanation on what the Energypod framework is that we've developed or conceived at this point. The Energypod model is our attempt to understand food from a very structural perspective. This is not a diet, and I'm going to repeat this again and again. We don't want you to take this as a diet. We want you to just take it as a tool, as a framework, as a fundamental foundational basis of something that will help you create a diet. You can think of it more like an operating system on your computer. And then your diet is basically the apps and other things that you would install on that operating system. That's how we think about it. The model is right now really in its infancy. We have been thinking about it for 3 to 4 years, and even now we haven't got the certainty or everything isn't set in stone. The reason is because the science on this is also in its infancy. It is mostly based on disintegration kinetics of foods and how foods breaks down in your body. But it's really fascinating because as we continue down this road, you're going to have a lot of these light bulbs in your brain start lighting up and everything starts making a lot more sense. And you'll be like, wow, why was I following diet camps when I can just simply understand how food works? So this is how we look at food. This is how we do our shopping day in, day out. And you can do that too if this sort of framework works for you. The goal here is to empower you guys. So when we learned about Energypods, we were thinking about you guys too at the same time. So anything else, Corey, that I might have missed on or not touched on?
I think that's pretty much it. The gist of the Energypod framework is to basically understand how food interacts inside the human body specifically and how it breaks down and how we absorb energy and nutrients as well. That is the basics. We can move on to how this eating actually works.
So eating works. First of all, we have to define certain terms, which I think is very important. Many people, even some of the nutrition folks, get confused about these terms. So let's delve into it. First term is satiation. So whenever you start eating something and 5 minutes in, you start feeling like you're completely full and you can't eat anything else, that's basically satiation. It is the temporary sensation of fullness that you feel after eating something. You just are so full, you're like, I can't eat more turkey. It's done. Over. GG. Then you have satiety. Satiety is the prolonged feeling of fullness that prevents you from eating in general, especially if it's something that you have been eating in the past. A lot of the times, this can be slightly overridden based on our observation if you're eating something really novel. Let's say you've been eating avocados for like 16 years, and suddenly someone puts a bowl of strawberries in front of you. You're going to destroy that entire bowl.
Whole bowl. Yep.
The entire bowl is going to be gone. So satiety can be sometimes temporarily overridden, but then again, over time, sensory-specific satiety or habituation effect starts to take over, and you get used to this new food as well. It's really fascinating how that works. One term that I would like to bring over here is energy compensation. Before I explain it, I would like to explain that satiety and satiation are good to have, but they do not predict energy intake. Even the satiety hormones, we've looked at the science and the study behind it, and we found out that these are not the perfect predictor of energy intake per se. Right. So we've moved on to energy compensation, which we think is a much more reliable gauge, but at the same time, this is it's a bit more vague as well at the same time, because it relies on many different factors rather than, satiety being reliant on certain hormones only. So energy compensation, in a very simple way, I would say is that, let's say if you eat 200 calories of food, and throughout the day, it causes a reduction of 200 calories, then that will be a full energy compensation. Now, if you eat 200 calories in a day and then it leads you to sort of overeat and it's not fully compensated, then it's going to favor a positive energy intake. So based on this sort of model, we've constructed a group of foods, which are obesogenic foods, anorectic foods, normalizing foods, and certain neutral foods. So an obesogenic food would mean that it would more than likely favor positive intake and have a weak energy compensation. Anorectic foods, you could say, are usually foods that are more than just compensated and perhaps lead to a negative energy intake. Normalizing foods, on the other hand, as you might have guessed it, they favor a weight normalization. Neutral foods, they have very little to no impact on energy intake. So this is basically how the simplest way to sort of explain where we're going with this. And one thing I really want to highlight here is that this is not set in stone. And I will also add that just because something says obesogenic foods, it doesn't mean that it's going to make you fat. You can combine something that's maybe quote-unquote obesogenic and with something that's anorectic, and you may end up normalizing. And you guys will understand more how this works as we continue down the road. Anything else, man?
Nope, this is a really good way to start and get people to understand what is going on here.
Corey, I'm going to leave you the choice of which foods we should cover. Should we go with the obesogenic, anorectic, normalizing, or neutral foods?
We're going to start with obesogenic because we all know that obesogenic foods tend to taste really freaking good.
Oh, yeah. Obesogenic foods. So these foods will more than likely, if you just consume these all the time, there's a high likelihood that you're going to start gaining weight and favor a positive energy intake. So fat-dominant obesogenic foods would be straight-up oils, butters, creamers, peanut butter with sugar added, Nutella with sugar added, and many nut butters that have added sugar as well. Now, something interesting that happens in some of these foods is that when they say no added sugar, and then they end up adding fruit sugar or somehow pulverized or processed or really refined. By refined, I mean a very low particle size sort of concoctions or sugars or whatever you want to call it into these butters, then you're basically not making a difference. It's still going to be considered relatively added sugar. That's a bit of a trap that many consumers can fall into. And they're like, oh, there's less sugar in it. No, but they threw in tons of pulverized fruit in a refined form in there. That's pretty much sugar. Did you know that sugar comes from sugar beets, which is a tuber? So yeah, you can literally turn anything into sugar if you really want to.
Yeah, sugar is sugar, folks. Some people like to say that table sugar is better than honey somehow, and they don't appear to do different things in the body. They seem to give you energy, both of them.
Yeah. So now that we're talking a little bit about sugar, let's move to carb-dominant foods that may favor a positive energy intake. Now, this includes sugary soda, fruit juice with like very little pulp or no pulp, or even some pulp at all. They're not really, they have a very, very, very weak compensation. Sugars of any kind, and I mean it, whether it's organic, made with plutonium refinement, doesn't matter. It's sugar, and no labels. Throw the labels away. Sugar is sugar. Honey, maple syrup, and all of the alcohol is going to be, I don't know if alcohol would be considered straight up carbs. I guess it would be. Let's just, for the sake of simplicity, let's just call them carbs. So all these alcoholic drinks are going to be favoring a positive intake. Wine, sugary cocktails, even some of these refined smoothies, which like really have a fast flow rate with low particle size of whatever their stuff that's in there, is probably going to favor a positive energy intake. Breads which contain any form of refined flour, and by refined I mean the kind of flour that you buy at a grocery store, for example, like really small, tiny particle size that you can barely. Yeah, exactly. So if it's ground up to that level, more than likely it's going to be easily just absorbed and sort of nuked into your small intestines because of how fast it disintegrates.
Have you ever eaten a whole piece of bread and then wonder where it went in your mouth?
Yep.
It vanishes.
Yep. Bread immediately starts breaking down in your mouth. That's why you get that sensation of this fluffiness just like start to deteriorate by the time it gets to the back of your mouth. That's digestion happening right away. Sort of like a slower version of the cotton candy effect.
Right. And that's happening because of those tiny, tiny particle sizes of the flour that are becoming rapidly hydrolyzed by your saliva.
Yep. So many carb-dominant foods with refined flour, even tortillas, tacos, burritos, all of these things. What's interesting is that though they have refined flour, we have noticed that these foods also have added fat to them, which takes us to the next topic, which is foods that have fats, carbs, and perhaps even protein involved in them. But because of their structural weakness and how fast they disintegrate, they may favor a positive energy intake. That's what we think. This would include foods such as soft cheeses, foams, that contain oil and sugar, and then you have frostings and toppings which contain sugar and oil. You have syrups, dressings, dips, milk chocolate bars, white chocolate bars, nutrition bars, like all these bars that have straight up added sugar, and they add a lot of sugar to them and refined carbohydrates to them. Then that will more than likely favor a positive energy intake. Now, I want to stop here for a second and explain something really interesting. When we look at sugar in a different way. At least we do at Ketogeek. We think of sugar as something that gives sweetness to something, and then it has the caloric component to it. Those are two different things in that respect. So let's move on. Certain condiments and sauces that contain sugar and fat are probably going to be favor a positive intake. Caffeinated beverages that contain lots of oil, creamers, sugars, sugary syrups. It's probably not going to be the greatest thing for you when it comes to sort of leaning up. Milk, protein shakes, protein waters, protein isolates, they're probably going to favor a positive intake. Certain crisps and puffs that contain fats and carbs together are probably going to favor a positive intake. Biscuit, cookies, pastries, muffins, donuts, waffles, baked goods, sugary, all these things are just going to be sort of favoring a positive intake. What we found out is that yogurt may also be a culprit. Not all yogurt. Yogurt comes in different shapes and sizes, and different types of them. So a yogurt that is going to be just straight up sugar, fruit pieces, and then just fat and some protein in there, and a drink made from that is probably not going to be as satiety inducing as, something that may be lower in sugar. So if you notice something that has a lot of sugar in there when it comes to yogurt, it might as well be a dessert, to be honest.
Right.
And then, go ahead.
I think when someone was to eat a sugary yogurt is regarded far and wide as a health product because because they attach some labels to it. There's a label gets natural on it. It comes from a natural source. Okay, then yeah, yogurt's good. So people go out and buy the yogurt, don't even look at the label. Suddenly you're consuming 25 grams of yogurt, 25 grams of sugar per cup of yogurt. There's a specific company that makes really delicious yogurt. It's like ice cream, but Fahad and I, we try not to touch it too much, as it will favor a really, really big positive energy intake.
Yeah, and it's really, really interesting how sometimes even the sugar-free yogurts can have a huge amount of energy value to them, per se. But then again, it's not as bad as something that contains all of the Hail Mary effects of sugar, fats, and even protein involved in a very poorly structured form. Breakfast cereal is interesting. It acts very similar to other forms of carbohydrates because it rapidly starts digesting in your mouth. What sucks, however, is that when you add even more sort of obesogenic, it's like the combination of something that's obesogenic and it's complemented by something even more. Like, for example, when you eat breakfast cereal, you add milk to it. It's like you're creating a double whammy of positive intake effect going on.
It's getting digested right in the bowl, actually.
Yeah, and then we saw this one video where this guy just threw even more fruit, and fruit's not that bad, but they literally threw in some, what was it, double cream in there?
Yep.
On top of the cereal, which was insane.
It was unmeasured, and he had a nice heavy-handed pour on it. That's just free energy.
Yeah, that is absurd. Free fat, free and free sugars, they're not the best, especially if you don't know what you're doing with them and they have no way to sort of control this intake. You can sort of modulate these things with some thickeners and certain texturing agents.
Right.
But that's a bit of a more of an advanced concept that is a little bit out of the scope of this podcast. So next up, Corey, what do you think? We go normalizing, or we go for anorectic, or we go for neutral?
Let's go for the next extreme, which is anorectic.
So anorectic foods are on the other side of the planet. Well, not really, but on the other side of the model. And a lot of these foods are very protein dominant. And the reason is because protein is the most expensive macronutrient on the face of this planet. And we can testify to that here at Ketogeek as well. And that is exactly why it doesn't come in many of these modern packaged foods or forms, which is also why there's not a lot of research that shows that protein-heavy foods will lead to a positive intake. Because the way how the protein interacts with other macronutrients, but the way it creates structures, they're very filling. There's no doubt about it. It's just that when you isolate protein away into simpler forms, like for example, if you make one of those protein crisps with some fat involved, or even protein crisps as is, you kind of do need the fat to make it even palatable.
Absolutely.
So those kind of chips are easily going to disintegrate and nuke your small intestines, favor a positive intake. But when it comes to the other side of the extreme, if we're talking about lean meats, then they're probably going to be anorectic in their nature. And this also sort of goes into the plant-based meats. If they share a very similar macro composition as the meat that they're trying to copy, then my guess is that it's going to stay exactly as is, like that. Low-calorie greens and veggies are probably going to be anorectic in their nature. Some of these can have a laxative effect if you consume too many of them, so I'm not sure how laxativeness can impact energy intake. So that's a future sort of topic we could excavate.
Maybe the lean protein thing is kind of interesting. It is an anorectic food if you just eat a bunch of chicken breast, for example, especially if it's shredded, pre-shredded. And if you only ate that chicken, it's probably going to make you feel full physically, but it's most likely not going to give you satiety. You're most likely going to eat some more food later because all you ate was literally protein, just the building blocks, and you're not giving your body energy, which is really what it wants.
Yep, so that seems to be the winning combination here. It's not about one macro or the other macro, it's a combination. It's kind of like how you build an airplane. You cannot build an airplane with just aluminum. You need the other components such as plastics, glass, and various other things to make it fly. So that's the same concept with food. We can't take just one macronutrient and generalize using that. We have to think of it as an entire structure. Now, moving away from the low-calorie greens, a lot of processed foods can be pretty anorectic too. Like, for example, if you take some lean jerky with barely any sugars added to it, or some biltong, which has no fat or no sugar in there, that's probably going to be very leaning and sort of favor the rabbit starvation sort of diet or endpoint. Lean fish and seafood is also part of this category. Basically, anything that's like 90% above is probably going to be leaning. And then turkey and low-fat bacon, if you really, really drain the hell out of bacon, it might be anorectic, but most bacon would either be, most likely be normalizing, but if you keep it sort of dripping in fat, then it may even move to sort of like an obesogenic sort of category. So it all depends, as you can see, based on what you make, which is also the trap here. When somebody says, oh, chicken curry is really healthy, you can make chicken curry in different ways, and each of them can have a different effect. Now let's move on to certain carb-dominant foods that we sort of touched on when it comes to like low-calorie greens. We talked about that. But boiled potato is an outlier here because of how filling it is. And also because of, like we were talking about a long time ago, Corey, the resistance starch, right?
Right. Yep. You cook a potato and you cool it down and you cook it again, and it's not going to give you the exact same impact on your glucose index as a regular cooked potato if you just cooked it and ate it right away. It's really interesting, and the effect continues to stack as you cook, cool, cook, cool, cook, cool. Just continue that cycle. You create more resistant starch in the potato itself. And that pretty much does not get digested, if I'm not correct.
Yes, you're correct on that part. It has very much... so the caloric value just continues to decrease every time you go through the cycle. It starts to go into the realm of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
But, obviously you can't go to infinity, really, per se. But yeah, a lot of these... the potato is definitely an outlier. And it's also important to note over here that certain foods like chicken breast, which have literally no seasoning on there, and boiled potato are kind of revolting in their own way.
They're bad, so you're probably going to want to add something to that, right?
Yeah, so you have to add like a 0-calorie sauce or something like that.
Yep.
To sort of make it even tastier and still be anorectic in its nature. Mm-hmm. So you could do that with either the boiled potato or lean meat. But yeah, greens with very much low calories or no calories, like even celery or spinach or any of these foods, some of these are revolting. I think kale's disgusting.
It's not good, no. And even at that point, like leafy greens and harder vegetables like a broccoli, for example, you may not extract all of the caloric value in that because these nutrients, micro and macro nutrients, are locked behind cell walls.
Yep. And so when it comes to fat-dominant foods, there's not a lot when it comes to anorectic foods because fat is such a compact form of calories. But if we were to sort of hypothesize here, I would say that seeds are probably falling into this category because they have so much fiber and there's barely any fat in them, unless you're creating seed oil and just compressing swaths of them. But yeah, you'll have stomach issues way before you start to...
Yeah, eating a seed is more akin to eating rocks than it is to eat a piece of chicken.
Yep, so it has its own intrinsic limiting factor. So now that we've covered obesogenic and anorectic, where do we go next?
Let's talk about neutralizing foods.
So neutral foods are foods that we think that have very little to no impact on energy intake, very much agnostic in their nature. Foods such as non-nutritive sweeteners will fall into this category. You have to be careful about your tolerance levels with some sweeteners.
Right.
Erythritol is the highest when it comes to bulk sweeteners, and then sucralose and aspartame are some of the low-weight, low-bulk sweeteners that provide the sweetness but don't have the weight to attach to them. Monk fruit is the one that we use for energy pods. That's a phenomenal one. Stevia is great too. I prefer stevia leaves versus stevia extract because the extract has a little bit of a bitter after note or aftertaste. Herb spices and 0-calorie coffee drinks are totally fine. Like black coffee is totally legit when it comes to neutral foods. And same goes with any other caffeinated drinks. Like recently when we were at the event at Feast It Forward, we had that Center drink.
Yeah, Center was pretty cool. It's just a sparkling water with some CBD added.
And I think they added a little bit of erythritol to it, right?
They added erythritol, yeah.
So it was in a tolerable range where I think it's like 7-10 grams of erythritol, which isn't much.
Yeah, and the point of using these non-nutritive sweeteners is to create something that's tasty, something that can literally just be enjoyed as an experience without having to add to the energy intake.
Yep. Same goes for vinegar, water, 0-calorie teas, 0-calorie sauces and syrups are totally fine. And then salt is totally fine. See, here's the thing about these flavoring agents. They cause a short-term increase in intake, but over time, you adapt to that sort of palate and flavor profile, and you are not going to consume as much. Diet soda, sparkling water with no added sugar, all cool stuff. Multivitamin pills and concentrates, they seem to have... They're good for you. They can be good for you in the context of the diet, but at the same time, they don't really have an impact on energy compensation or energy intake per se. Stimulants, pre-workouts with no added sugar or no added calories per se fall into the same categories, into this category. And so basically, in a nutshell, all these drinks, which have little to no calories, are going to be relatively neutral. Now, once you start adding calories to these drinks is when you start noticing a positive energy intake, because the way our body processes liquids is just it just goes straight to your small intestines. Yep. It's literally pre-processed or pre-digested for your body.
Yeah. The picture I like to paint is a liquid type food or something with really low structure has the ability to run all of the red lights in your system, basically, your digestive tract. So when he says they nuke your small intestine, they literally run past everything and nuke the small intestine.
And they go straight into absorption, which is how when you take a pre-workout, the effect of the pre-workout is very fast. Within 20 to 30 minutes, you start. If it has beta-alanine, try that with a beta-alanine pre-workout. You'll notice that the tingly sensations you get from beta-alanine show up in like 20 to 30 minutes, depending on if it's consumed with a mixed meal or on an empty stomach. On an empty stomach, it's going to be even faster.
It feels like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Pretty quick.
I haven't done the calculations on that or the math on it, but it feels really fast. So that's the power of destabilizing or destructuring a certain food component. The absorption rates skyrocket. So you turn basically something that might be a sluggish tank into a straight up rocket missile. All right, we've covered neutral, we've covered obesogenic, we've covered anorectic. Now we're going to move on to normalizing foods. Now, just to put the reminder again, just because it says normalizing or obesogenic or anorectic doesn't mean that they're bad. We cherish all kinds of foods, and it's up to you to find the perfect fit. We just want you to be aware of that these are the foods that we think are probably going to lead to a positive intake if you consume copious amount of it. This is a very unique way of looking at foods as a whole. Normalizing foods. So let's start off with the fat-dominant normalizing foods. So almond flour is an interesting one. And the reason why we put it over here is because it is coarse and in your digestive tract. So carbohydrates are interesting because a lot of carbohydrates, like for example, if you eat rice, they get eroded over time. Now, almond flour also gets eroded in your stomach, but at the start, as soon as you eat almonds or any sort of nut butters or nuts or so, they gain in volume as soon as they hit your stomach. So they induce some sort of a mechanical satiety or satiation right away. And over time, they dissipate the nutrients and they start breaking away from that sort of engorged food matrix. That's how almonds and nuts are digested, which is really fascinating. And then there's some microstructure analysis, which shows us that certain proteins combined with fats sort of even further slow down the digestion of these nut-based products.
It sounds kind of like how rain clouds work. Rain clouds, they collect lots of moisture, and they get really big and swollen and heavy. You see these giant dark gray rain clouds, and then off in the distance, you can sometimes see dissipation happening. It's letting it off very slowly, rather than it all coming down at once, like a waterfall. Yeah,
and that's also one of the reasons why, let's say, when you eat a bowl of rice, that's quite filling, right?
It is.
But you can eat the same volume by same caloric value in the form of Rice Krispies, and it's not as filling. And that's the same principle in action over here. When you eat boiled rice, then it takes erosion. It just basically starts sort of outer layer, start disintegrating, and all the way to the shell of the rice, and eventually the rice is going to get totally digested. With Rice Krispies, when you start munching on it, it doesn't erode. It literally gets destroyed in your mouth.
Right away.
Yeah, it literally just digests.
Yep.
So that's why there's a clear difference between Rice Krispies versus like straight up rice. So that's something that we found was very fascinating and interesting.
And the only thing that happened between rice and Rice Krispies was an alteration of the structure.
Bingo.
That's it.
Do you see the power of the structure? It's like one modification and you just change the entire thing. And it's literally this. Note over here. Energy density is pretty much the same. And the nutrient density is pretty much the same. So we still just basically destroyed the whole thing.
Yeah, it's just basically your Rice Krispies are a nuclear attack, and your regular rice is just a very gentle sprinkling, you can say.
Yep. So this is the cool stuff that we found out by understanding the structure of foods. Hopefully this will help you as well. Moving on from almond flour, plain stew is going to be probably just totally fine because it's basically a soup. And what we mean by stew here is that there's no added sugar or not a lot of added fat. It's not a lot of sauces. What we're thinking about is something that has water, some protein, protein chunks in there and some fat, like a tablespoon of it or so. Not a whole lot, but enough to sort of get into your stomach and induce some sort of a satiety effect. We'll talk a little bit more on that when we talk about something like a curry eventually down the road. Nuts are totally fine. What we found out about nuts, I mean, people already know. We already sort of talked a little about nut flours. I mean, it's the same thing, very similar. But nuts, we've also found out in different studies that nuts are really interesting because they don't really favor a positive intake. They're usually compensated by a reduction in intake. That seems to be the trend when it comes to a lot of the studies that we see as well. Most of the times, because they're considered higher in calories, people think they're going to favor a positive intake. It's really not the case. You're going to have stomach ache before you really start going to town with the nuts.
Yeah.
So there's that problem right there. Normal cuts of meat, which have quite a bit of fat on them, are probably going to be normalizing foods. Now, be careful about certain sausages, which are absurd. There's like 7 grams of protein and it's like 25 grams of fat in there.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
That's not a sausage. That's literally just a cut of fat.
Yeah.
Colored orange or something like that.
Usually it's the summer sausage that is the biggest offender of that. And it's just a type of sausage. They're super delicious. They're also so fatty. They're literally oily as you cut into them. Oil is coming onto the knife.
Oh man, that's revolting. I find too much fat to be really nauseating. And it's really interesting that you flip over the label and you're like, one link is like 200, 250 calories. Holy mother of Jesus. And nobody's eating one. They're always...
Oh, no.
Yeah, you're always going to eat like 4 of those.
Oh, yeah.
And meanwhile, our energy pods are like 250 calories. Like the entire thing that nukes you and sort of fills up your stomach and all that kind of stuff... It's like 250 calories.
They're harder to eat than a sausage, too, because the thing just coats your mouth and it just starts to stick around and it's so flavorful that you don't want to eat it all at once.
Yep, you would start invoking a thirst response before you actually finish the energy pods. That is just a fact.
Yep.
All right, so we've covered these really fatty cuts of meat. But if you find like 12 grams of protein and it's like 15 grams of fat, that's sort of on the good side, you know?
Yeah.
Same goes with hard cheeses. Hard cheeses are very, very, very... They're slower to break down in the digestive system. That's what we found out.
They also have less lactose because most of that stuff's going to turn over into... whatever it's broken down by lactase, the enzyme that breaks lactose into smaller components. Therefore, it doesn't hit your, again, glucose index as hard.
Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Okay, so after cheese, let's move on to dark chocolate bars. Personally, my favorite dark chocolate bars are anywhere from 55 to about 70%. Corey, what's yours?
Just about in that range, too. Sometimes I'll creep up to 76, but anything beyond that just becomes torture.
Yeah, but at the same time, I haven't had a chocolate bar in a year.
Especially after creating Chocolate Nova. I don't think we have actually gone out to buy any chocolate.
No, I have not bought a single chocolate bar.
Nope.
I know I bought that candy bar the other day, but that was because it was like $1.99 and I was having a really long day and I was like, I needed something rapidly just going into my system.
When you work all day and you're hitting about 7 o'clock and you've literally intaken 0 calories... It's kind of nice to have those things.
Yep. And at the same time, it's also important to note over here that you and I, we consume and make these energy pods. Our palate has adapted to the energy pods, so we don't find them as craving. Like, people think the energy pods are like the tastiest things they've ever tried in their life. But for you and I, because we've eaten so many energy pods, it's like, yeah, it's kind of awesome.
It's that dang sensory-specific satiety, man.
Yeah. For me, I would rather... consume, for example, 2 pounds of strawberries in one sitting than a full-blown energy pod, even the Chocolate Nova, which is by far known as the tastiest chocolate on this planet. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that's hilarious, man.
Yeah, people don't realize that our palate just consistently adapts and it's become such a subjective experience.
Right.
So after our dark chocolate bars, let's talk about, we just talked about sausage actually. Salami is in the same boat. Burger patties, I think 80% is totally fine. And even 73%. If you, I like to drain my beef patties.
Beef patties, they come with cheese usually.
They do?
Well, if you go to a restaurant.
Oh, yeah.
Get yourself a cheeseburger, you know?
Fair enough. But here's the problem with a cheeseburger. It's not just the bread. See, the thing with the cheeseburger is it comes with the bread, and the bread is loaded with carbohydrates and lots of fat. we really underestimate the amount of calories that are in bread.
Remember when you were crushing those tortillas, you were just making wraps because in our minds, we were like thinking, well, a tortilla is literally just carbohydrates and then you just add lean protein. So you have energy and protein, good to go. You looked at the label after eating like 4 or 5 packs of these and you're like, holy crap, there's so much oil in these.
Oh my God. It's like one of these wraps is like 200 calories and these are like really large wraps.
Really big ones, yeah.
Maybe even more than 200. I don't remember, but it was a lot. Holy moly.
Sneaky.
They might have just dipped the bread into like a vat of oil and just pulled it out. That's how it's just crazy.
Well, they do these things because it creates a favorable texture.
Yep.
They're not thinking about energy compensation. That's why we need to bridge food science and nutrition.
Bingo. Nailed it. So we've covered burgers. Another thing to mention over here with burgers is that we talked a little bit on the obesogenic section about sauces and dips. Those buggers can pack in some serious amounts of calories in them and very free calories that rapidly just disintegrate in your body. The thing is, these sauces have other components. Like, for example, they'll have certain emulsifiers that further expedite the rate of digestion. And it just becomes straight up, just like down your stomach, into your intestines. Very fast stuff. Seafood, fungi, mushrooms are totally fine here in the normalizing category. Nut butters with no added sugars are totally fine. What else we got? We can move on to the carb-dominant foods. Carb-dominant foods, a lot of them, if you're just like not combining carbs and tons of fat together, are totally fine, actually. And it seems like with carbohydrates, it's about the particle size, which plays a very important role. Because erosion happens with carbohydrates when you digest them. Just like we were talking about rice. Same thing happens with wheat fruit that you can eat as well. And same with oats. That's why they have a more blunted response to glucose. In some ways, you can think of glucose and insulin spikes caused by carbohydrates as a way to show a downstream disintegration effect of the carbohydrate itself. Really fascinating. There's studies on that, and we can see that happening as well. Which is why if you take straight up sugar, it's going to have a much faster influence on your blood glucose compared to, let's say, some like a whole wheat fruit.
Yeah. I think brown rice is one of those things that people like to eat if they want to blunt the effect of carbohydrates from rice nuking the intestines.
Yeah. So it's all the structure. I mean, it's still rice, but brown rice is different from white rice.
Yep.
Interestingly enough, we talked a little bit about potatoes earlier. Potatoes need to be brought back here because potatoes are very unique in the fact that when you eat them, they act like a sponge. Meaning that through the processing in our body, the sugars escape away right away. So they just get expelled from the food matrix. And then the remaining husk stays there to induce some sort of a satiety effect. That's what we think is going on over here. We don't know that there is some mechanistic evidence and vitro models that show this sort of effect with potatoes. Potatoes are interesting. What's also interesting is that potatoes can be in the anorectic category as boiled, disgusting potatoes, or you can really, really refine them further and then turn them into potato crisps, add some, fat dip them. I'm just going to call it fat dipping. A lot of these carbohydrate-heavy foods are just fat dipped. So if you fat dip these refined potato flour and create crisps out of it, you're no different than basically everything else that is just going to favor a positive energy intake.
Eating a weak structure plus a weak structure with tons of energy locked in, not even locked in, it's just right there, ready to go.
Yep. But if we go and put our reverse back into our carb-dominant foods that are normalizing, we can move on to whole wheat fruit and fruits as well. Fruits, I think that raw fruits and dried fruits are totally fine. They should be okay. Luckily, I don't think dried fruits get fat dipped.
No, I don't really see that happening too much. I guess if you count a raisin, you have yogurt-covered raisins.
Oh. See, now that's a complex food matrix. Next up, we have cooked legumes, soy, tofu, tubers. As long as you don't add fat dip, we're just going to create that term.
Fat dip.
If you don't fat dip these foods, then you're totally fine. Same with pasta, rice, quinoa, hemp seeds, and all that kind of jazz.
Remember the salad that we had over at one of our events?
Best salad ever.
It was really good because they added, instead of every single green they can possibly think of, they pumped up the salad with buckwheat. And so the buckwheat was soft. It was like kind of chewy, had an earthy flavor. It was really tasty, man. I like that stuff.
Really tasty, and it wasn't fat dipped.
No, it wasn't. Not at all. And salads are one of the most fat dipped things on this whole planet, man.
Oh, yeah.
You know how much fat people like to eat with salads? It's not the leafy greens they're eating. They're going for the fat. I swear to God.
I'm just saying, we need to sort of patent the term fat dipped.
Done and done. Let's start.
Fat dipped, sugar dipped, or carbohydrate dipped. That sounds weird. All right, so next up we have normalizing foods that have fats, carbohydrates, and proteins in them all together. So this could include certain vegetables, actually, which may have some sort of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And then you have nutrition bars, which are sort of considered processed foods. But if you have nutrition bars that have high particle size, high particle size carbohydrates, sort of like a granola, but not made with super ultra processed, low particle size flour. It has full wheat in there or full fruit in there. And then there's no added sugars per se, and they have a decent sweetener in there, not maltitol. That one has a very low gastrointestinal tolerance. Then you're fine. Then you're good over here with nutrition bars. And make sure that these nutrition bars have some amount of protein in there because your body does need protein. Certain viscous yogurts are totally fine too, as long as they don't have boatloads of extra stuff added to them, especially added sugar. It's really easy to add boatloads of sugar to some of these foods. It's so easy.
I used to add sugar to my Honey Nut Cheerios when I was a kid.
My God.
Imagine that.
Yep. And I assume you probably added milk on top of that?
Yes. And the reason why we started to add sugar to the cereal is because sensory-specific satiety kicks in. The sugar is the cereal's boring after eating it for a week. So then you start to add sugar to it, and probably even other stuff like spices and stuff like cinnamon.
Yep.
So you're just making it literally as tasty as possible by altering it on a weekly basis.
Yep. You're basically creating a bit of a perfect storm of craziness. So how do you navigate through this food system? Well, there's many different ways, and we're going to talk about that in the next podcast, where we turn this entire model into something more practical, and how we shop, how we do things. I think that will be very helpful to all of you listening. But in lieu of time, considering that we have nearly burned through 50 minutes, including the introduction, let's talk about something that's really important over here. And I think, Corey, you wanted to really hammer this part in, which is the mindset behind this model and how we should be approaching towards diet. So what was your stance on that?
Absolutely. The first thing that we consider in this framework, Energypod framework, is time. Time is the most precious thing that you have on this planet in this lifetime. Absolutely. You need time to do things, and time dictates all. So we want to use this Energypod framework so we can create foods for ourselves that not only give us energy, give us the building blocks that we need in our life, that's protein, but it also saves us time. Where else are we saving time besides the cooking in the kitchen? Well, you're saving time by not having to listen to a diet guru, because the diet guru is going to give you recipes, and those recipes take time on every single step, from the shopping, from the cooking, from the prep, to the cleaning, to the eating. Everything requires that precious commodity, time. So those recipe gurus are also not concerned about your time, and they're more likely to have given you processed information, something that suits their own agenda, basically, so they can create more recipes and sell you more even of that stuff. So imagine if you had a framework that you don't need to listen to someone else to tell you what to do, what to eat, but you kind of already understand what this food is doing, and you can actually go to your kitchen and create foods that are processed, or just use prepared foods. You can literally go into Whole Foods, go to the salad bar, and then select things that will be 20 times better than what 99% of the populace is going to select. And you're going to do it faster because you already know how to identify these things, because they've worked for you in the past, as well as you use this Energypod framework in your life. So this is going to give you back time so you can focus on adventure, your work, your family, your people, your friends, all the more important things that make life what it is. Now, I know that everyone in America loves getting things fast. Well, processed foods does that. It really does cater to your instant gratification. When you grab a prepared food, like a whole cooked chicken, it's just ready. You can grab that and go and spend your precious time on the things that you love after you have energized. And that's pretty much all I got on how time works into our framework here, Fahad. And I think you can really talk about these really cool stats that you found not too long ago.
So one of the topics that I really wanted to hit hard over here, which gets brought up a lot and really gets me fired up, is that a lot of people say that food is addictive, don't they? Like processed food is addictive. Basically anything they're not selling is pretty much addictive. That's the mindset we have. It isn't even about helping people. It's about painting a bullseye on something so that you can sell your own stuff. That's disgusting. So when it comes to addiction, let's talk about facts over here. Only about 5 to 10% of the people in the general population are purported or possible to be addicted. And this is based on the Yale addiction scale. This is something that Stefan Guyenet, who was on our show, he wrote an article on examine.com. He mentioned that, so I'm going off of that. But that doesn't explain everything. So if you were to say that all processed foods are addictive, then we would have a certainty of the fact that everyone's addictive to these kind of foods. But our obesity rate is 40% or more. It's reaching that point. Overweight, 70% or more. So 5 to 10% does not explain the 70 and 40% rates. So what does this show, though? It shows that a lot of people who may be completely healthy may be addicted to food, and we're trivializing their struggles by simply saying that everything's addictive. At the same time, we're creating this some sort of an unhealthy user bias where you're saying that anybody who's overweight and obese is by default, by proxy, eating disgusting processed foods and addicted to their foods. That is not helping anyone. You are spreading misinformation to the rest of the public if you're doing that just because you want to make money and you want to just do your own thing. You're not helping anyone. Stop using this kind of garbage terms. People are important. We need to value them. We need to help them, not use these kind of bad stats just to confuse them. I see that so much even in writers on mainstream media. They're just crazy. It's absurd how they do that. So let's stop with this bad information. We need good science, good consumerism. We don't need dogma or being a zealot or diet camp fanatic. A lot of the times when I engage with people from different diet camps, I see this theme again and again. It's about protecting my identity and dying on the hill of my own ideology. It is less about helping people. I see this even in intellects and scientists within our country and within even our research groups. Stop this. We need better foods to cater to a better modern life. That's what we need. Good science. Processed information is the problem. The biggest catastrophes in human history have occurred not because of processed foods, but we had bad ideologies. Mein Kampf, Hitler, all of these things. These were ideologies. These weren't processed foods. If anything, during these tough times, people created some really innovative foods that worked for them during the times. By doing all this, you're trivializing the struggles and the journeys we've taken as human beings. So, be good. Don't just look good. That's how you live life. And that's the end of my rant. What do you think, Corey? Let's move on to something else here.
The Energypod framework is meant to make smart consumers.
Yep.
That is what we're here for.
Yep, and I really wanted to say this kind of stuff because it is so prominent on these poorly researched social media and online narratives. It's less about science. Like the last episode we did about plastics was the same story. People just want to look good. They don't want to be good. We have to be good. That's how you create a better world. Invest in better stuff. Be productive. Bring value to people's lives. Appreciate innovation and a better life for others and yourself. That's how you do it. Don't just go around and say like, oh, I just disagree. Oh, you're just a dummy. Oh, you're just wrong. Accept the fact sometimes that maybe the other person may know something that I don't know. So lead with questions rather than judgments right off the bat. You may be wrong. Most of the times, you may be wrong. And this goes for even the most intellectually brilliant people. Lead with questions, please. Sometimes, even the intellectual people, their kryptonite is that they think very linear in the ways. So, think outside of your box. Question. Ignore the person who's just shouting on the top of their lungs and have very little value or solution towards humanity. Now let's move on to something called the FAQ. Some of the questions that people may have with regards to the Energypod framework are as follow. First question, we've kind of addressed it. Is this a diet? Well, no, it's not a diet. It's basically a framework. We learned something and we're going to try. We're just sharing with you guys, and you can build your own diet using it. So that's your own story over here. This is your own jigsaw puzzle that you need to create. What about nutrient requirements? Right now, this model does not cover nutrient requirements, but we do recommend 1 to 1.2 grams per kilograms of protein, which is on the safe side. If you're a high-performing individual in the sense that you're an elite athlete or we want to build muscles, you may want to increase that up a little bit. For most normies, probably like a handful of protein is going to give you close to that amount. And maybe if you are all well and good, you can supplement that with certain protein shakes. I consume protein shakes. I know it's not going to be as filling, but it adds to the certain caloric requirement because I lift very heavy stuff. And put it down as well. Just don't hold it all the time up in the air. So if you are one of those people who don't understand how food works, I think maybe, or you're having troubles understanding what the calories are, then using a macro calculator is a great idea, but you may want to just move away from it whenever you can and focus on good food rather than just to stick to a macro calculator. But for people starting off, it may be all right?
I did use a macro calculator when I started really counting stuff a long time ago when Ketogeek first started, about 5 years back. It gave me the base of what works my body. Like, it just gave me that snapshot, what I needed to see. And then I basically just intuitively know what to do now. I don't need a macro calculator anymore. My body seems to be pretty dialed in on its own signaling.
And you got something called a brain.
That's right.
So that works out really well. So what are some of the limitations of this framework? There are many limitations. Considering that I just talked about nutrient requirements and we don't factor in macros and micros in it yet, we're mostly focused on the structural component and disintegration kinetics. There are some other things that we need to also consider. For example, we don't know what happens to the body in low intake conditions. Like, does appetite get really suppressed, or is it just some sort of placebo effect? We don't know, per se. We also haven't put in some advanced concepts such as emulsifiers, thickeners, or certain things like that may also have a key role in modulating nutrient delivery. What about mixed meals? Yep. So this was a very interesting topic that I want to talk over here. You can somewhat do an estimate and approximation on how mixed meals can work. For example, let's look at a cake. So a cake is different sort of simpler components that we talked about earlier combined into one thing. So cake is basically a spongy bread with fats and oils and carbohydrates, all that kind of jazz. And then the frosting is something that we talked about as well. It's basically sugar and fat and certain thickening agents per se. So all of these foods, if you look at our model and framework, a cake, more than likely, if it's got these refined flours and all that kind of jazz, is going to favor a positive energy intake because of how it is structured. So you could modify the cake a little bit by adding maybe whole fruits instead of straight up sugar in there, or you could do some other substitutions like add a sweetener that has a non-nutritive component to it, and that could help with the structural components and make it sort of like a less sort of higher energy compensation per se, by reducing the amount of calories that are in there.
Right.
And then you have something like, for example, a chicken curry. Now, the chicken curry can be different types. So, for example, if you were to make a chicken curry with just like simple stew, not a lot of stuff added, not a lot of fat added to it, no sugar per se added to it, or very low amount of sugars added to it, and then you put some lean chicken on there, then you're going to have something that may be normalizing or even anorectic, who knows. But if you take the same curry and doesn't just add tablespoons of fat and tablespoons of sugars and sauces to it, and it just has a melt in your mouth flavor, and instead of of chicken breast you're using a lot of fatty cuts of chicken, then it may be normalizing or maybe even obesogenic depending on the structure of the food. So this gives you a very intuitive idea of how to eat these kind of foods. Now it can get even more advanced. Let's say if you're at McDonald's, over there things can become a little bit harder because you're having a drink and you're having a burger and you're having some fries alongside it. So sometimes what can happen is that one food component may have an influence on the other component. Like let's say if there's a beverage, potentially hypothetically speaking, that may act like a digestive aid for the other part of the component of the food. So that may have an influence on how fast the primary food item in that meal is digested. So there's some factors in there. We're going to talk a little bit about this, actually a lot of it, in our next podcast when we take some practical steps and takeaways. Same with salads. Salads could be very anorectic in the nature if you just consume a bunch of leaves with some very simple 0-calorie sauces. You're probably going to create an anorectic salad that way.
More likely, people are going to fat dip their salads.
Yeah, they're going to fat dip, sugar dip their salads, and then by the time they eat it, it's basically no better than just straight up chugging those things down, those calories down.
Go for flavorful vinaigrette, for example, that has no calories.
Yeah, and a lot of the times what happens with some of these salads is that the fat and the calories and the sugars all break away from the basically the main matrix of the food and start to disintegrate on their own. So that's a potential thing that could happen. But then again, this is very advanced. Even we have blind spots over here. So this is somewhat hypothetical in that sense. As we get better science on this matter and we understand the dynamics and kinetics of disintegration, we can give you guys a bit more information on that matter. Now, let's talk about something that is very controversial. People say that processed foods are hyperpalatable and they can be addictive. We've already addressed the addictive part. It doesn't add up. Hyperpalatability is an interesting concept, but it is, once again, it is poor in science.
It gets blunted by sensory-specific satiety, though.
Sensory-specific satiety, meaning that there's diminished pleasure obtained from eating the same food.
Yeah.
Let's say if you eat a chocolate bar, then you may eat a lot of it right away, but within the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, you may get really fatigued on them, and maybe months down the road, you'll be like really disgusted or revolted by it. There's that chance as well. Just like how it happened with our Energypods as well. It's like we're so used to it, we don't crave it per se, even though it's by far undoubtedly the tastiest chocolate on the planet. So that happens with basically every single food item when it comes to palatability. And another thing we know, and by the way, this sensory-specific satiety has been studied to be the same similar in lean and obese individuals, as long as they're matched for their, and if there is no underlying eating disorders or restraint involved, per se. And at the same time, we also know that our palate adapts based on the frequency and level of exposure of whatever stimulant that food product brings with it. So it's kind of cool how that works. So instead of saying that, yo, no, this is really tasty and I'll probably overconsume it, that's a great thing because now you can actually add tasty foods to your diet and habituate yourself to them. I think that's amazing.
Absolutely.
So another question that people may ask is, what about plant food versus animal-based foods in this model? I think that for most vegan meats, for example, they're totally very similar to how meat would function as long as the macros are very similar and the structure is not too different. It won't be such a big deal for most normie people. And so yeah, that's all I got to say for plant versus animal food. There's really...
We just need to see some more improvements from the plant-based foods. That's what I really want to see. And I think we'll start seeing those improvements as food science and nutrition science start talking to each other more.
Yeah, that's a big void that needs to be filled up. Right now, we need less diet-based research. I think that's a big problem. Because the practical
it's an ideology.
The practical manifestation of diet-based research is a bunch of confounders. Like, for example, if you create let's create a fun little diet of our own. A diet of eating just rocks. The rock diet. That's a terrible analogy, but let's go roll with it. So let's say if you created the rock diet, not the rock Dwayne Johnson diet, but the rock diet, there's going to be different types of rocks, right? They're going to be small pebbles. There's going to be rock from, from India. So there's going to be different type of variants. And somebody who might be eating one rock, the other person might be eating a different kind of rock from a different kind of architecture or structure and may have a different disintegration kinetics. Same thing with the Mediterranean diet. There can be multitudes of variants of the Mediterranean diet. What may be used in research may be completely different from what the person is eating. And we just showed you how even a simple thing as rice, just by modifying the structure and in keeping the energy density and nutrient density the same, you still kind of end up with totally different results when it comes to satiety and energy compensation and energy intake. Crazy.
I think now we're going to get geologists listening to our podcast because they're now going to be able to relate food kinetics to rock kinetics, because shale and granite are completely different things. Granite is more like whole wheat. Shale is more like bread.
Oh my God.
Isn't that crazy?
That's insane.
Shale's weak structure, granite superstructure.
And rocks also contain a lot of metal and other sorts of residues and materials
and nutrients that our body actually uses that can be found in plant and animal sources.
You know, that's a great point. What we need to do is turn rock into nutrients. I know plants do that for us, sort of, kind of, with the soil.
A little bit. Mm-hmm.
Yep. But what if we just bypass all the plants and animals, just start harvesting rock?
Sequester asteroids for their food.
Yes, that will be the future of foods. That is exactly what needs to happen. Speaking of future, what about the future of this model? Well, over time, this model is going to evolve. You guys can subscribe to our newsletter at Ketogeek.com to stay in touch with it, or you can visit Ketogeek.com/model, which really has a ghost version of this model up there. But I think over here, we have taken something that we've learned over the last 3-4 years and simplified it and tried to explain to the best of our abilities to anybody who's listening to our show. What do you think?
I think it was a really good podcast, and it was a serious breakdown.
Yeah, and I think people will start noticing, oh, wow, this food does that, this food does that. There's going to be a lot of light bulbs shining up in your head.
Exactly.
And so you'll be like, wow, this is mind-blowing, which it is, because that's how we felt when we found out about this.
Yeah, so, and imagine, remember when we were plagued by ideologies and food and stuff, probably like 7 years ago for both of us, and then we learned about this? It was like a light shining on the brain.
Indeed, indeed. So now when we go to a food buffet or a place where there's a lot of fun, we're not afraid of food. We enjoy the food. We even have carb-heavy foods from time to time because we know how the carbs work and we know how the fats work and how these structures are combined together. So now you know how to build your own diet. So what you can do is make sure that you get enough protein through the protein sources so that your body stays intact and the muscles are there, because you kind of need that stuff. And then on top of that, you start adding energy from different ways, whether it is a form of anorectic food if you want to lose weight, or if you want to go for a normalizing, then eat some normalized favoring foods, or you can go with something that may be obesogenic and compensate by adding something more anorectic. So mix and match. This is your canvas. This is your story. This is your life. Focus on it. Create some great memories and tell us if you get some results out of following this sort of approach. That's how we do it. You can do it too and enjoy life. Corey, that's about it, right?
That's it. And I hope that everyone that has listened to today's episode has become 1% smarter. Become a smarter consumer every day. Keep learning, guys.
Yep. Come back next time for this, the episode 3, where we start doing some practical takeaways about the show. If you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts or any of your podcasting medium, please leave us a review. It takes about 10 seconds. We only have 66 reviews, while all these zealots have like 660 reviews. Guys, how can we change the world if you guys aren't going to go out there and leave us maybe a 1 review? It takes 10-15 seconds, right? We got to change the world. We got to improve people's lives. Go out there. Please leave us a review. And with that being said, thank you so much for being on the show with us, and have a good day, evening, morning, night. Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can visit us at www.ketogeek.com to shop our products or subscribe to our newsletter so that you can stay in touch with all the latest and greatest information we have to offer. Don't forget to leave us a review for this show, as word of mouth is the best form of marketing we can get. Now let's change the world for the better together.